In this video, I will discuss 5 CMMI interpretation issues I have seen over the years and some suggestions for fixes. Hello, my name is Neil Potter and I help software and service organizations adopt practices to make their organizations work better. Please click below to subscribe for future videos. So firstly, let's discuss the model briefly and the 5 issues, and then I'll discuss each in detail and a suggestion for a better interpretation of those issues. So firstly, we have the model. Again, both the dev version, here's dev, and then the services model. So given the type of work you're doing, pick dev or services. And then if you know where you stand at the beginning, like I am running at level 1, much risk, problems, rework and chaos, then the model kind of tells you what to go work on first, second and third. And here are the 5 common interpretation issues I see, misinterpretation issues. One is CMMI means waterfall. That means people think the model actually says you should do things in a sequential waterfall kind of fashion. CMMI is about documentation, not result. Again, that's incorrect, and we'll discuss that in a little while. Internal processes should refer to the language of CMMI and refer back to the practices. So as if you have to kind of write your processes internally in the organization to kind of match exactly the way the practices are stated in the model and the language and words they use. CMMI requires tailoring guidelines for every process to exist. Again, that's false. And then peer reviews don't count in the appraisal when you appraise against a particular level when a project manager is involved because he or she is not a peer. The first 4 are very common pervasive interpretation problems that I've seen over the years, and the 5th one is a unique one I kind of threw in there for the discussion today, just to kind of clarify. If you see these kind of issues, then beware and maybe stand your ground and have them fixed. So the first one, CMMI means waterfall. So quick background of this. Any project of any organization will have a life cycle of some kind. It may be defined somewhere, but they're doing things in a particular order, maybe good or bad, and therefore they have a life cycle, a project life cycle. Typical ones are agile or iterative. Basically, the team has broken up the work into pieces, and they try to produce a piece of the work every 2 to 4 weeks to get feedback. Sequential, where the company or project is defining things sequentially, like requirements, then design, code or service delivery, and a closeout. Now, even companies that are doing sequential or waterfall, typically like hardware organizations, hardware development, even those companies add a lot of risk mitigation to mitigate the risk of being waterfall, but sequential means in order. And then hybrid, where maybe the first part of it is sequential to discover the project's needs and kind of who cares about what, and then as they figure that out, they then deliver things incrementally over time. So again, here's some 3 classical or standard or common life cycles that people are going to use. And so in the model, it actually says pick your life cycle or define your life cycle. It may have been the case at the beginning where an individual saw an example of a group at level 2 or level 3, and they were using waterfall for their project life cycle and then equated the 2 things together. But actually in the model text, it has been like this for a long time, where it actually says pick your own life cycle and pick the one you like, and then add practices to it to kind of raise the bar about how people perform. So here's the language of the current model. It actually says develop an approach for the work. Approach would imply technical approach, life cycle approach. Here's some example approaches we discussed before. But there are many things you could put under the word approach, but one of them would be a life cycle. Now, in previous versions of the model, it actually used the word life cycle. Pick a life cycle. Now they've made it more generic to say pick an approach. So clearly, over 30 years plus, they have never said use waterfall or you must use waterfall. They've always said define a life cycle of your choosing, and then add practices, which are the blue dots, to the life cycle. Now, going beyond that, at level 3, and it's always been the case, that if you have a process defined that has more steps than you need, like they define process steps in your organization for doing teams that are on different continents and how you coordinate many teams together, but you don't have that situation in your project at this time, you can tailor those things out. So in any good process, it will be made generic that you can tailor things in and out for your particular situation to adapt it to kind of how you do your work this time. That allows you to have a generic process defined with many options in it, and then you can tailor those as you see fit for your particular organization. The practices of the model are still being performed, but the degree to how you do them or how you do them will change each time given the situation of your team. So number 2, CMMI is about documentation and not result. Again, this has been a chronic issue over the years, and it applies to any framework. It applies to ISO 9000, even Scaled Agile, Waterfall, CMMI, you name it. People have stumbled over the issue. Is it about documentation or about result? And this is a purely interpretation problem about implementation, about making sure we're focused on the result of the project and the company and using process stuff to help achieve that. So for example, we have an agile team here following an agile process, and we care about the result at the end. And the result would be software that actually functions and works correctly for the end user. So we backtrack from that point and then add practices to achieve that. Maybe add practices for a better backlog, a clearer requirements or clearer user stories, and adding better practices here for doing the iterations and engineering the solution, and even better practices at the end for doing a final test. So again, if we start with an end result of the project, then we add things to fix issues or mitigate problems that occurred before that particular point. Same thing applies in the services world. We may want to do a good project proposal, and we have activities to scope the proposal and write the proposal and actually make sure it's a good proposal so we're likely to win. Again, we're adding practices to the way we do our work to get a better result at the end. So the documentation issue, it comes down to elegance and thinking through how to do that correctly. Yes, we can build a bad backlog that is cumbersome, wordy, and difficult to read, maybe overnight, or we can spend the time to think through what a good backlog is and how to write it and use it that is both elegant and simple and effective for people to pick up and use downstream. That takes a bit of time and effort to think through a good backlog, a good proposal, a good test plan, etc., so you can actually use the things correctly downstream later on. It is easy, actually too easy, to basically write past documentation because we think the CMMI needs documentation and then going to get stuck with it. If you look at this example here, basically what we've done is taken the agile lifecycle, the yellow boxes, and added practices to them to get a better result. But then we have to figure out where to capture the results of that. For example, capturing the requirements in a Jira tool or Excel spreadsheet, or capturing the design as design notes that are tied to a particular user story. If we go through the services kind of world and we're looking at improvement, again, do we write a 1,500-page document or how to improve the organization, or do we have a simple task list organized about what to improve and kind of how to improve it, and we go through maybe a workflow to do improvements and get the improvement back out there to the organization. So number 3, internal processes need to refer to CMMI language and practices. So the idea here is that a company's been told incorrectly that if they want to be level 2 or level 3 or use CMMI, then they need to kind of refer to the language and the wording of the model so they look like they are interpreting or using CMMI correctly. This is completely false. Here's an example of a process, a very checklist-styled process, which I think is a good idea. And then the company figured out that it should use the wording practices in the process itself. Purely optional. If you have no other good wording to use for requirements, and we're discussing requirements here, then yeah, sure, pick up some words out of the model and learn a few new words and use the words, if you like those words like illicit requirements. However, if you already have your own words to define these steps, like gather requirements or write requirements or joint application development, a JAD session with the customer, then I would say use your own language. Secondly, there is no need to refer to the practice number in the process itself, I have done that this time in this example here for companies getting started to know that they are doing things and not missing something out of the model. Like to begin with, they write their process, a checklist style would be good, and they refer to the practice number initially so they know they haven't missed something or they are learning where that thing kind of goes. But eventually they may decide to kind of get rid of the label here, the extra label, and just have a process defined for themselves in their own kind of way and not worry exactly how it maps to the CMMI right now. That can be done at a later stage by having the appraisal team then write a separate mapping document to map what you have done back to the model. It doesn't have to be part of the process itself. So I think the key points here is to write in a language you like, using keywords that you actually understand and the company has used before or will use, and making sure the process is understandable from your perspective, and then only if you need to map back to the practices of the model so you know things are being covered, but then don't stick with that if you find it kind of not particularly useful. Number 4, CMMI requires tailoring guidelines to exist for every process. Completely false. Actually, even in the model it says you don't have to have tailoring guidelines for everything. You tailor where there are options to consider from a user perspective, a process user perspective, like a project manager. If he or she is like, what do I do next? And how do I deal with this particular situation in my project? Then the tailoring guidelines are put in there to consider or to give advice for what to do in different situations. For example, take elicit requirements. So if you are given good requirements from a customer perspective, maybe you don't need to elicit anything else and you can go to analyze. Okay? And maybe analyze is where you then elicit or find the mistakes in the requirements and then kind of fill in the mistakes because there are ambiguities in there. Or if you're given a situation where you're given no requirements or very poor requirements, ambiguous requirements, then maybe you follow these steps here to kind of fill in the details, like an SME, subject matter expert. You build questions to resolve, and you're going to do mock-ups to kind of show the end users what could be possible and get their feedback to fill in the requirements. So again, if you have a situation where there are many paths through this, different situations in your project, then tailoring guidelines are put in there to help you navigate a good set they're going to use. Instead of having a different process for different situations, you have one process with many options in it and many paths through that kind of cycle. You may have a situation where you have one process that works great all the time for every situation and therefore has no tailoring guidelines whatsoever. That is perfectly adequate. A lot of teams that I work with do Agile or Scrum, and therefore they've kind of nailed the Scrum process down to a set they kind of like on every situation. And there are very few tailoring guidelines left because they've figured out a good process for almost every situation. So tailoring guidelines are there for situations that exist where there are many pathways or a couple of pathways they're going to choose. You don't have to have tailoring guidelines for every process. If you hear that situation from your consultant or your lead appraiser, you should consider abandoning that person like now. Okay, you are spending money on bad advice. Don't do that. So number 5, peer reviews don't count when the project manager is involved because he or she is not a peer. Don't count like for an appraisal. Like you could do an appraisal and the lead appraiser would say, you can't use that data or examples because we found out that the manager was involved in the peer review. Completely and utterly nonsense and false. Okay. A peer review is basically where the team sits down, either virtually or in person, and they're looking through a document. It could be a proposal, piece of code, test plan, project plan, whatever, and they're finding mistakes in the document before the next person gets it and uses it. It could be a customer getting code or a customer getting a proposal. So you're basically cleaning up the work and getting mistakes out of it before it's kind of too late. So about 25 or 30 years ago, there was a concern that if the big boss showed up at a peer review, he or she may find mistakes, which is good, but then they may beat you up at the end because you made mistakes, and then your next performance review would be kind of negative because you made mistakes. So they would have an abusive approach to using the data or information learned in the peer review. And so the idea is that the peer review is peer level, similar colleagues at the same organizational level. So you wouldn't have a big boss involved in the peer review discussion and wouldn't have to suffer the consequence if they were abusive and use the data incorrectly afterwards. Nowadays, peer review means the similar kind of expertise. That, like, you have a person available to you, your team or outside, where they can find mistakes in your work. It could be an expert, a team member, a customer, whoever, because they have a background in the work you're doing, better design skills, coding skills, or whatever. They can find mistakes in your work, help you out before it becomes too late downstream. So I think peer review means, in this case, peer at an expertise level, and you have to then figure out if you involve the CEO and the CEO is nasty, don't involve the CEO. So peer review does not mean necessarily you can't have non-peers there. It means you have people there that have a background to find mistakes in your kind of work. Then to have an interpretation that says, oh, we found a PM in your peer review, and therefore we're not going to count your peer review activity in the appraisal. It's a complete and utter abuse of the model itself. Okay? And if you find that kind of interpretation, then you just want to cut ties quickly, okay? Because you have somebody that really doesn't understand at all. If the peers you involve in your peer review work out for you and they can help you find mistakes and clean up the work quickly, that is the intent, and therefore you're good to go. Now, I have been writing articles and videos and things for a good 25-30 years. So if you go to this website here, you can see the categories of things I've been writing about. In terms of things related to CMMI or framework adoption, things in the blue: improvement, planning, CMMI appraisals, process development, planning management, engineering process groups, and doing requirements are some example topic areas to go look at later on. In summary, look out for cumbersome or incorrect interpretation issues, and if in any doubt, reach out and get a second or third opinion. All practices of all frameworks are there to be interpreted in a way to help you run your business better. Thanks for watching this video. For more help on these and similar topics, please see the links below.